Good evening, Energy Rogue Nation. Welcome back to another weather discussion. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I have missed all of you tremendously. I know we've been updating you guys on the WX Rogue Discord page, but it's been a while since we've done a video, and I think, unfortunately or fortunately, this is the time to do it. And so I appreciate your patience. Like I said, if I'm not doing a video, I definitely want to get out a written update and or a voice message. So I've been very, very consistent about that for a reason. And we've also been doing a lot more updates than usual because of the circumstances that surround Hurricane Helene, which this morning was a tropical storm, and we've actually seen that strengthen considerably into what is now a Category 1 storm. So in tonight's video, we're going to be talking about the latest with Hurricane Helene. We are really, as I like to say, going to throw the buffet table at you. Okay, we're going to be talking a lot about the current observations, and we will also be talking about the current model guidance for what we can expect over the next 24 to 48 hours as it relates to the system and who's going to be impacted. A lot of breakdown tonight, so strap in, listen in, and if you have any questions, be sure to post those in the WX Rogue Discord channel. Many of you have taken full advantage of that. I've seen actually most of you asking questions, whether it be about this storm or in the past asking questions about temperature trends. Whatever it relates to weather, be sure to post that in the channel and I will get to those questions promptly. So let's dive in. As I mentioned, we currently, as of tonight's update, have Hurricane Helene, Category 1 storm. And if we were having this conversation this morning, I was essentially trying to do a video update this morning, but technical difficulties have been plaguing me the last few days. This system was really producing some deep convection across the gap. And when we refer to the gap, we're really talking about this area in between the Yucatan and the Caribbean. And so because of that really deep convection, that rapid development we saw this morning, it has led us to where we are right now. And if you're wondering what happened this morning, well, if we were to wind the clock back to last night, go as far back as, let's say, 7 p.m. in the evening on Tuesday night, this system had a sea level pressure of about we'll call it 995. Right? That was the pressure of what was then Tropical Storm Helene. Between 7 p.m. and then all the way to, say, 7 a.m., we saw that pressure drop from 995 down to as low as 982. So do the math, that's about a 13 millibar drop within 12 hours. That's pretty substantial. And to me, that would constitute intensification. And that is something that we continue to see tonight as Hurricane Helene is now currently at a pressure of 979, according to the last reconnaissance mission. This storm, as it has already intensified, is, believe it or not, going to be intensifying even more than where it's at right now. So we are not done yet. This storm has not even tapped into its true potential. As a matter of fact, what you're going to see on a lot of our model guidance is as this storm moves its way into the Gulf, begins to make that northeastward trajectory towards the panhandle of Florida as well as Georgia, we're going to see this storm intensify into a major, potentially even as high as a Category 4 by the time it makes landfall by Tuesday night into Friday morning. So let's go ahead and head on back here. We're going to look at a couple of products first. And so I guess we'll start with our spaghetti plot of what the current ensembles are showing. By the way, for those of you that are new here, this is the Hurricane Helene model track guidance, and it's meant to show you all the different models that are interpreting the path of the system. For example, you see a lot of these different lines and different colors. That's indicating different models and different solutions. And as you can see, because of all these members being essentially clustered into one area, that's giving us a pretty high confidence of the pathing, which pretty much takes us near the Panama City area and even up towards Atlanta, Georgia. We're going to talk about Atlanta, Georgia later on in tonight's video. because believe it or not, Atlanta's actually under the gun for this hurricane too. And you might be thinking that's pretty crazy because they're so far inland, but this storm really is kind of a runaway freight train, as I would like to describe it. More on that here a little bit later on. But you can tell by this ensemble view, every single one of these members, pretty high confidence that we begin to see more of this north to northeast trajectory into Atlanta, Georgia, into the panhandle of Florida. We're talking about Panama City. We're talking about Tallahassee, seeing some direct impacts from this storm by the time we get to Thursday night into Friday morning. And then we eventually do see this system sort of hang around Kentucky and Tennessee and really produce some substantial rainfall for a lot of folks and some flooding for some of those inland states. So that is the model blend, but what about the strength of it? Well, our ensembles have pretty high confidence at this point that we will see a major. On the right, this color table is showing you the pressure, and so towards the right, in a lot of these colors, are also showing different interpretations of the model. So just like what we talked about in the last product, this is now showing us essentially what all the different interpretations are. And clearly, there's not just confidence in the pathing of this storm, but there's also confidence in the strength of it, because you see very faintly, you get some pinks and even some purples to show up, kind of blended within all that kind of dark red. That's telling us that a lot of our ensemble members are even showing, a 940 to a 950 millibar hurricane, and that's on the conservative side. If we were to factor in some of our other hurricane models, which are not plotted on this map, we're talking about anywhere between a 920 to even a 930, which is certainly by pressure threshold for a major, but also one that could get close and actually touch Cat 4 status. So the other thing I want to show you is we talked about the magnitude. Well, here you go, right? So this is that same blend we were looking at just now, except it actually depicts some of that severity in terms of our wind speed in knots. And you notice that we have quite a few members that are outputting a Cat 4. Now, this is a very bullish forecast. My prediction still remains anywhere between, I would say, a mid-end Cat 3 to a Cat 4 low-end. But regardless of how you look at it, folks, this is going to be a major hurricane at landfall. And at this point, on probability's sake, it's really looking like about a 90 to 95% chance we see a major at landfall. The National Hurricane Center has also put that out on their latest advisories, forecasting for a major hurricane landfall out towards the panhandle of Florida, and then eventually that make its way inland by Friday morning to places like northern Georgia, where, as I mentioned, we could also see impacts there as well. So let's take a look at some of the model interpretation here. And actually, before we do, I did hint at the reconnaissance missions that's been going on. Remember that when we start to have fears of a hurricane landfall and direct impacts being made to the United States, the U.S. government will send out reconnaissance missions, one being from NOAA and the other one, I believe, being from the Air Force. And yes, we have an Air Force mission and a NOAA-based mission, and their job and responsibility is to cut across these storms in a big aircraft that can sustain these kind of winds and environment, and essentially drop a device also known as a drop sonde. And so they'll cut across the system, as they do here, sort of like a big X. And as they're doing so, they're cutting across the center, doing multiple rounds of doing so. And in the process of that, they drop a drop sonde, which does exactly what it sounds like. It is literally a device you drop from the aircraft, and it falls through the layers of the storm. And what you're looking at here, for example, is the latest reconnaissance mission from this evening, and this is showing us the drop sonde data from NOAA. For example, you can see that this is plotting your temperature and your dew point, 850 millibars high. Actually, this would be 750 millibars. And so, for reference sake, this would be about several thousand feet high above what would be the hypothetical surface. And so, as that drop sonde is dropped from about 7,000 feet, that continues to fall all throughout the layers of several thousand feet. So from 7,000 feet all the way down to the surface. And that information is then read back to to the folks flying up in that beautiful aircraft that cuts through these storms and reads back information such as our dew point, which is highlighted here in green, and our red, which is highlighting our temperature. Now this is important because when we start to talk about rapid intensification and begin to have those conversations, it's important to read the observations that's happening in real time. Many times our models can be helpful, but they're not meant to replace meteorologists like myself. Otherwise I'd be out of a job if they were so perfect, but they're not. They have limitations. And one of the limitations is that sometimes the environment works faster than the model output can produce. So in a case like this, where we're trying to establish whether or not this storm is undergoing rapid intensification, well, the models will interpret it as such, but we need to see what's actually happening in real time. So, for example, this dropson that we've been talking about now the last 3-4 minutes and giving a really strong prelude to, this is telling us how saturated the column is. And based upon this, we have some dry air intrusion here all throughout the column, but for the most part, it's actually pretty good. I mean, 87% relative humidity at 850. We got about 454 meters high, still sitting at about 90% relative humidity. It's not 100% saturated, but it's pretty darn close. So in a dropson sounding like this, that tells me that this storm has a lot more room to run and it's developing beautifully. There is no, large plumes of dry air. You don't see your dew point veering off to the left, your temperature veering off to the right. You have a pretty well-defined center, as this was taken from the eye, and a really strong, low-pressure, closed center that is inhibiting any dry air from intruding into it. And there really isn't much dry air to go around to begin with. And the other measurement we can get from these reconnaissance missions is the other important factor, which is our pressure. And this is actually as of the time of this video. We mentioned that the pressure at the start of the video was 978. Well, based on this reconnaissance mission, they did a couple of run-throughs. It looks like after 2 cuts of the center, this pressure is now at 975. So it's updating in real time. This is really beginning to bomb out right now. So over the next 12 to 24 hours, we are expecting Hurricane Helene to become a major by the time it gets closer to the panhandle of Florida. Let's go ahead and play that here on one of our hurricane models. These hurricane models actually help us better depict intensification. Our GFS and some of our long-range models, they have a little bit more of a aggregate of a resolution, meaning that it's not as high resolute as, say, the HWRF is, which is the model we're looking at now. And the HWRF is specifically a hurricane model, so there's other features that it's factoring in, a little bit more emphasis on some other variables that the GFS and some of those other common models don't pick up on. So this takes us into tonight. It has it forecasted as a 963. Right now, it's, again, about a 975, so I will say, based on this model output, it looks like the system is slightly underperforming some of these hurricane models. But nonetheless, as we take this forward, by the time it passes the big gap in between the Yucatan and the Caribbean, look at the pressure, guys. That huge drop-off. It just drops like a rock as that progresses northward to the point where even the HWRF is showing a 919 millibar system. Now, I will say this, based upon what we just observed, unless if it can make up some ground on its rapid intensification cycle that is about to be underway, I anticipate this system will likely make landfall probably between, say, I'm going to be kind of broad of my range, but I'll say around a 925 to a 935 millibar system, which would put it somewhere around a high-end Cat 3. And I even said before mid, so we'll say mid to high end to low Cat 4. That's really the ceiling that it has. And so that's what the HWRF is showing. A lot of our other hurricane models show pretty similar things. So if we take a look here, for example, at the HMON, very similar, as a matter of fact, has it making landfall right as a 925 to about a 935, which is actually what I was predicting prior to looking at this run. So right within that range, a little bit more on the conservative side. Well, we can take a look at one more here. That's the HAVS A, another hurricane model. And this is also being even more conservative at about a 941 millibar. So I would say that the H-Wharf is probably the most hawkish of the three, and I wouldn't put all of my eggs in one basket with that. I think based upon what we're observing, based upon the environment that it's in, I think that as it stands tonight, we are likely going to see within that range, as I mentioned, between a mid-Cat 3 to as high, for a very brief period, as high as a low-end Cat 4. Now, one thing that I want to mention before we depart tonight's video is we talked about Atlanta, Georgia. So let's focus on that here for a second. We'll take this model ahead as it passes through the Panhandle. Look what it does when it gets up to northern Georgia. This is still anywhere between a 960 to a 970 millibar system. What that means is this system is not going to weaken right away. As a matter of fact, this is going to be close to an inland hurricane as close to Atlanta, Georgia, essentially right within that Atlanta metro. We could be talking about sustained winds anywhere between 60 to 70 miles per hour for those folks. And, remember, when we're talking about hurricanes, you also have to factor in the vulnerability. How many people are truly going to be impacted? And so, we could certainly have the argument about, things like storm surge. I know we won't talk about that tonight, but of course, the 10 to 15 foot storm surge across the Panhandle and the flooding and tornadoes will certainly be a hazard and a vulnerability to those that live along this area, which aren't that many outside of Tampa, Panama City, and Tallahassee. But the real concern, aside from the Panhandle, is Atlanta. Now we're talking about an even denser population center. And so they're going to be impacted as well. And look, it won't be a Category 4 by the time it moves here into Atlanta, but make no mistake about it. Think about what happened with Beryl in Houston. That was a Category 1. Now granted, Houston, their building codes, their infrastructure has some difference between that of Georgia. There is some variation there. But think about all the impacts that it made as a Category 1. Now imagine that same impact for a city like Atlanta. A large population center, various different socioeconomic backgrounds, various vulnerability. This is certainly a recipe for disaster. Now, I also am not saying that we're going to see a catastrophe on our hands. I certainly don't want to be in the business of hype casting. What I will say, though, is that we can't forget about Atlanta and northern Georgia. This is going to be a hurricane that impacts them too. So this could be a very costly disaster once this is all said and done. And there is a crap ton of people that will be under the gun of this when you factor in Atlanta, you factor in Panama, Tallahassee, and even to some degree, indirectly, Tampa Bay and St. Pete. So, listen, thank you guys so much for tuning in. And before I was about to leave, there's one last thing that I wanted to show you guys, and that is wxrogue.com. I just want to plug this real quickly, and don't worry, I'm not making any money off this plug. This is actually just a resource that you guys can utilize for free for the time being. This has all your cooling degree day information as well as your population weighted cooling degree days. But the reason why I'm bringing this up now is because I just want to make a plug of this before we talk more about this next week following Helene. We've actually added a product that provides total degree days based upon the two charts above it. So for example, I'll go through this quickly, but we have cooling degree days for top 5 populated cities, and those are all plotted as linear lines, right? Down here is the same product, but they're stacked. So for example, if we look at September 26th of 2024, so that'd be tomorrow, this is the GFS run. It shows those same lines above, except what it's plotting here on the y-axis is a summation of all those cooling degree days to give you more of a total. So think of that more as a total degree day chart as opposed to a just regular cooling degree day. Utilize this. Let me know your feedback on it. As I mentioned, I will be getting out a survey here by either this Friday or the weekend, so be on the lookout for that. But aside from this website, we'll talk more about it next week. Our eyes, in the meantime, are on Helene. They will continue to be on Hurricane Helene, and we will have another morning update for you tomorrow. It's going to be in video format this time. I'm really excited about it, and we'll be talking more about the latest with that hurricane, and who knows, maybe tomorrow morning we wake up and it may even already be close to a major by this time tomorrow morning. It's truly spectacular what is happening with this storm. And I say spectacular, and I say it in a more queasy way because we also know the human element of these storms. While Mother Nature can show its beauty, it also can show its terror, and it can show what damage and destruction and displacement of lives that it can bring. So we'll be tracking all of that. Thank you guys so much for your feedback. Thank you so much for your support. And we'll be back here tomorrow morning with another Hurricane Helene update. Take care.